In this video, we're going to take a look at section 4.5, which is factoring trinomials of the form ax squared plus bx plus c. And this time our a is not equal to 1. So in the previous section, we saw trinomials of this form, x squared plus bx plus c, where the coefficient of x squared was 1. Now in this case, these types of trinomials, the coefficient of x squared can be some other number. So we have two methods for factoring out these types of trinomials. The first method we're going to take a look at is called the trial and error method, also known as the FOIL method. In reality, what we're doing here is we're guessing and checking. But we have certain terms to guess and then check. So we know that trinomials, so let's take a look at this first example. We know that trinomials, when we factor them out, it's going to be in the form of some binomial times some other binomial. When I multiply my first two terms together, I multiply these two terms, it has to give me 3x squared. Now my only option for these two terms, in order for me to get 3x squared, has to be 3x and x. Or you could put it as x and 3x, it doesn't matter. But these are your only two options. Okay? One of them has to be 3x and the other one has to be x. Now, when we multiply our last two terms with each other, when I multiply this term and this term, it has to give me negative 56. So now you have some options over here. First, in order for us to multiply two numbers together and it gets negative 56, one of them has to be positive and one of them has to be negative. Okay? So let's go ahead and try out some numbers, try out some terms. Okay, so two numbers that multiply to give me negative 56. We can go ahead and try out, say, 8 and 7. Let's make one of them negative. Let's say we have a minus 8 over here and a plus 7. Okay. Now, we don't know if this is the correct factorization yet. What we have to do is we have to check to see if we get that correct middle term. Now, to check to see if you get the correct middle term, multiply the inside with each other. So negative 8 times x, you get negative 8x. Multiply the outside, so 3x times 7, I get 21x, and then add them together. We get positive 13x. But notice our middle term is supposed to be negative 13x. So this factorization does not work. Now, all we were off here was by a sign. So let's go ahead and change the signs and see if that fixes it. So we have 3x, let's put plus 8, and let's put x minus 7. Check the middle term, so multiply the inside, and then multiply the outside, and then combining. This gives us negative 13x, which is exactly the middle term we were looking for. So this is the correct factorization over here. We have 3x, so this combination works here. So we have 3x plus 8 times x minus 7. And now we just factored out that trinomial. Now let me go back just a little bit. So we saw an example in the previous section where we did have a number in front of our x squared, but we were able to factor that out because there was a GCF. But now if you take a look at this particular problem, there isn't a GCF. Okay. Reason why is because first 3 doesn't go into 13 evenly, and it doesn't go into 56 evenly either. Okay, so we can't factor that out. So we have to use this method called trial and error in order to factor this. Let's take a look at another one. Okay, so we want to factor, we have 3x squared plus 5x plus 2. So we know this is going to factor into two binomials. When I multiply my first two terms together, it has to give me this 3x squared. So my only options is 3x and x. And when I multiply the last two terms together, I multiply my last two terms together, it has to give me 2, positive 2. Okay. So let's go ahead and try out plus 1 over here and plus 2 over here. And I'll check to see if we get the right middle term. Multiply the inside, you get 1x. Multiply the outside, you get 6x. If I add them, I get 7x, which is not the right middle term I'm looking for. I want 5x. So let's go ahead and try to rearrange those numbers. Let's try out Okay, let's try positive 2 here and a plus 1 here. Okay, check the middle term. So we get 2x. 3x times 1 gives me 3x. If I add them together, I get 5x, which is exactly the middle term I was looking for. So this is the correct factorization. 3x plus 2 and x plus 1. Let's take a look at one more using this method. So factor, so we have 24y squared minus 46y plus 10. Okay, now before I start trying to use the trial and error method, take a look at these three terms that we have, and notice we have a GCF here. There's a number that could go into all three of these, which is 2. So let's go ahead and factor out that 2 first. And then we'll try to use the trial and error method with whatever we have left over. So we have 2 on the outside and we have 12y squared minus 23y plus 5. So now we have quite a bit of options here for this trinomial. Okay. So all I'm worried about right now is factoring what's inside the parentheses. Okay, we'll leave this 2 alone for now, and then at the end we'll add it to our answer. So we know it has to be 2 binomials. And I know the first 2 terms, when I multiply them together, it has to give me 12y squared. Okay. So now we could either do 12y and y, or we could try 3y and 4y. Okay, so let's go ahead and try out. Let's try 3y and 4y. Okay, so 3y times 4y, that gives me that 12y squared that I need. And now my last 2 terms has to give me 5. Okay. Now pay attention to the signs here. The middle term is negative, and then the last term is positive 5. Now the only way that you can multiply 2 numbers together and it gives you a positive, and then when you add them together it gives you a negative, is both of your terms have to be negative. So that tells me we have to have a minus for both of these. And now let's go ahead and try out a combination. So 2 numbers that multiply give us 5, negative 5 and negative 1. And let's see if this gives us the right middle term that we're looking for. Multiply the inside, you get negative 20y. Multiply the outside, you get negative 3y. If I combine them, perfect, I get negative 23y. So this time we got lucky, we kind of got it on our first try. But now, our final answer, remember the 2 that we factored out in the beginning, our GCF? This has to be part of your answer. So we have 2 times 3y minus 5 times 4y minus 1. And now we have it completely factored. So this was the trial and error method. Now let's take a look at another method for factoring these same type of trinomials. This is a more systematic approach. So this is our next objective, factoring trinomials of the type ax squared plus bx plus c, where a is not equal to 1. We're going to be using something called the AC method, also known as the grouping method. So using the AC method, what you're going to do first is you're going to multiply your a and your c with each other. Next, you're going to find 2 factors that multiply to whatever the product of AC was, and they have to add up to b. Then you have to rewrite this middle term using the 2 factors that you found. And then you will go ahead and factor by grouping. So you're going to start off with 3 terms, and then you're going to rewrite it into 4 terms. And then whenever you have 4 terms, the method that you use for factoring is grouping. Okay. So let's take a look at this first example. So we have to find factors of a times c. Well, my a here is 4, and my c is negative 3. So I need 2 numbers that multiply to give me negative 12, and then the sum has to be equal to 4. So 2 numbers that multiply to negative 12 and then add up to 4. So we could go ahead and use, let's say, negative 6 and positive 2. Negative 6 times 2 gives me negative 12. And if I add them together, this gives me negative 4, which is not the right combination. Let's go ahead and switch the signs. Let's say positive 6 and negative 2. If I add those together, that gives me that positive 4 I'm looking for. So now we're going to rewrite the original trinomial that we had. We're going to rewrite it into 4 terms. So we have 4x squared. Let me put this in red. So this 4x, I'm going to change into plus 6x and then minus 2x. I have minus 3. So I rewrote 4x into positive 6x minus 2x. Now I'm allowed to do this because if I combine like terms again, this gives me that 4x. So now that we have 4 terms, let's go ahead and factor by grouping. Group the first 2 terms together, put a plus, and then group the last 2 terms together. 4x squared plus 6x in my first group, and I have negative 2x minus 3 in my second. Now go ahead and factor out the GCF from each one. So first group, I can factor out a 2x. I'm left with 2x plus 3. And now remember, I want my second binomial to be the same. Now what I can do from the second group, I can factor out a negative 1. That way it switches the sign. And we end up with another 2x plus 3. Now we have the same binomial. We're going to go ahead and factor that out. 2x plus 3. And then you write out what's left over, which is the 2x minus 1. And then we're finished. So use the method that you're more comfortable with. This AC method, it is a more systematic approach, whereas the trial and error method, you're kind of guessing and checking. Let's take a look at a couple more examples. So factor, here we have 4x squared plus 37x plus 9. Always take a look to see if you have a GCF first. So if I look at my 3 terms, they don't have any common factors, so there's no GCF. And now notice I have a number in front of my x squared. I have a 4 in front of my x squared. So now that leads us to either using trial and error method or the AC method. So let's continue with the AC method. We're going to have to find factors of, so it's a times c. So we have 4 times 9, which gives us 36. And then the sum has to be equal to 37. So I need 2 numbers that multiply to give me 36 and add up to 37. Well, we could use 1 and 36. If I multiply them, gives me positive 36. And if I add them, I get 37. So now let's rewrite the middle term. So there's 37x. I'm going to rewrite it as plus x. This is really like plus 1x. And then plus 36x. And I have plus 9. Now we have 4 terms, which leads us to grouping. So group the first 2 terms, put a plus, group the last 2 terms. And now factor out the GCF from each group. So from the first group, I can factor out an x. I'm left with 4x plus 1. The second group, I can factor out a 9. And then we're also left with 4x plus 1. So we have a common binomial here of 4x plus 1. So let's go ahead and factor that out. And now we're left with x plus 9. And then remember, you could always check your work by multiplying them back out. So if I multiply 4x plus 1 with x plus 9, I end up with the trinomial that I started off with. Let's take a look at one more problem. Okay, I want to factor, so this one looks a little bit different. 10y to the 4th minus 7y cubed minus 12y squared. So remember, always look for a GCF here. So in this particular problem, we do have a GCF. Our GCF is, since they all have a y squared in common, we're going to factor out a y squared first. And now we're left with 10y squared minus 7y minus 12. And now we could go ahead and use the AC method to factor out what's left over in the parentheses. So we're looking for factors of 10 times negative 12, which gives us negative 120. And then the sum has to be equal to negative 7. So I need 2 numbers that multiply to give me negative 120, and then the sum has to be negative 7. Now remember, the only way that you can multiply 2 numbers and it gives you a negative is one of them is negative and the other one is positive. Okay. So now let's try to think of some numbers that we can use here. So this one, it might be a little bit more difficult. Let's say, let's try negative 10 and positive 12. But if I multiply these out, so they give me negative 120, but if I add them together, it gives me a positive 2, which is not what I'm looking for. Okay, so let's try some other numbers that multiply to give us negative 120. We can use negative 2 and 60. Okay, but this is going to give me a positive 38, which does not work out. Okay, so this one's a little bit more difficult to try to think of the factors. Now, one trick that you can use for trying to find out these factors, since right now I can't think of it right now, you could break this up using a factor tree. So break it down to completely prime numbers. Okay, so I have 2 times 2 times 2 times 3 times 5. So now these are the numbers that I have to work with. Okay. So you're going to use a combination of one set. So let's say if I use these 3 2's together, this gives me 8. That means I have to use this 3 and 5 together, which gives me 15. And now remember, one of them has to be negative. So if I make the 15 negative, okay, negative 15 times 8, that gives me the negative 120. And now if I add them, it gives me the negative 7, which is exactly what I'm looking for. So this is like a little trick that you can use if you get stuck trying to figure out what the two factors are. So I have positive 8 and negative 15. If I add them together, that gives me negative 7, which is exactly what I want for my middle term. So now let's go ahead and rewrite our middle term. So I'm going to rewrite this negative 7y. Now remember, keep in mind we're just working out what's inside the parentheses. So I have 10y squared. Now that negative 7y, I'm going to rewrite it as plus 8y minus 15y. And I have minus 12. Now it doesn't matter if you put the negative 15y first and then the positive 8y after that, you're still going to get the same result. Now let's go ahead and group the first two terms, group the last two terms. So I have a 10y squared and then plus 8y. I have a negative 15y and then a minus 12. And now factor out the GCF from each group. So for the first group, I can factor out a 2y. And I'm left with 5y plus 4. Second group, I can factor out a negative 3. And that gives me a 5y plus 4 as well. So I have the same binomial. So I can factor out that 5y plus 4. And I'm left with 2y minus 3. But now this isn't our final answer because remember in the beginning we factor out the GCF of y squared. So we have to add that back into our answer. Let's put that in the front. So we have y squared times 5y plus 4 times 2y minus 3. So a little bit more going on in this particular problem, but just remember, always look for a GCF first. That way you could break down the problem a little bit, and then you're left with smaller numbers. So that was it for this section. If you have any questions, just email me and I'll help you out.